At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, when most homes across a quiet American neighborhood are wrapped in silence, a small glow from a phone screen can feel louder than any sound. In the stillness of the night, when the world seems paused and nothing urgent appears to exist, a single message can carry a weight that changes everything. That was the moment a man named Jason Miller, a 47-year-old husband and father of two, woke suddenly in the darkness of his bedroom. For years Jason had lived what many people would describe as a steady and respectable life. He worked long hours managing construction projects across his town, paid his mortgage on time, attended his children's school events, and followed routines that rarely changed. His neighbors knew him as dependable, the kind of man who waved politely when passing someone on the street and who rarely attracted attention. Nothing about his life suggested that it was quietly approaching a moment that would shatter the calm structure he had spent 15 years building. But at exactly 2 a.m., the phone resting beside his bed lit up with a message that would alter the course of several lives before the night was over. The message came from a name Jason had not expected to see appear on his screen again. The name was Emily Carter. For a brief moment Jason stared at the screen, his eyes still adjusting to the sudden light in the dark room. The message was short, only 6 words long, but the meaning behind it felt far heavier than its size suggested. It read, "We need to talk. Right now." Those words might appear simple to someone reading them during the middle of the day, but in the quiet hours after midnight they carried an entirely different tone. Messages sent at that hour rarely arrive without urgency. Jason had not spoken to Emily Carter in several months, and seeing her name appear on his phone after such a long silence immediately stirred memories he had tried carefully to leave behind. Emily Carter was 38 years old, a real estate agent who had arrived in town a few years earlier hoping to rebuild her life after a difficult divorce. She was known by colleagues and clients as confident and determined, someone who worked hard to establish herself in a competitive industry. The first time Jason met Emily had been during a housing development project where he oversaw construction and she handled property sales. Their early conversations were professional and brief, but over time those conversations grew longer, and eventually they formed a connection that both of them understood was complicated from the beginning. Jason Miller was married when he met Emily Carter, and although he had never planned to allow the friendship to become anything more than a professional relationship, circumstances slowly moved in a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. Late meetings about housing contracts turned into conversations about personal struggles and long work hours. Jason spoke about the pressure of providing for his family while balancing demanding projects that required constant travel between job sites. Emily spoke about the loneliness she felt after relocating to a new town where she had few close friends and no extended family nearby. Over time, the connection between them became something they tried to keep hidden from the people around them. For Jason, the secrecy weighed heavily on his conscience. For Emily, the relationship created expectations that Jason struggled to meet. Eventually the tension between those two realities reached a point where they agreed to end the relationship and stop communicating entirely. That decision had been made months before the message appeared on Jason's phone that night. As far as Jason knew, Emily Carter had moved forward with her life just as he had tried to move forward with his own. That was why seeing her name appear on the screen at 2 o'clock in the morning felt so unsettling. Jason sat upright in bed and read the message again, as if the words might change the second time he looked at them. "We need to talk. Right now." There was no explanation attached to it, no greeting, and no additional details. The urgency of the request left little room for interpretation. For several seconds Jason considered ignoring the message entirely. After all, months had passed since their last conversation, and reopening that chapter of his life was something he had tried very hard to avoid. But the longer he stared at the glowing screen, the more difficult it became to dismiss the message as something unimportant. Emily Carter was not someone who usually contacted people in the middle of the night without a reason. Jason knew that if she had reached out at that hour, something significant must have pushed her to do so. With a deep breath he unlocked his phone and typed a brief reply asking what was wrong. The response came almost immediately. Emily asked if they could meet somewhere quiet and talk face to face. She insisted that the matter could not wait until morning. At that moment Jason Miller had no way of knowing that the decision he was about to make would place him at the center of a mystery that investigators would later spend months trying to understand. Because by the time the sun rose later that morning, Emily Carter would no longer be seen by anyone again. Before we go deeper into the story and uncover how that message at 2 a.m. began a chain of events that would affect an entire community, take a moment to join the conversation with viewers from around the world. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened after Jason Miller read those 6 words would lead to a series of decisions made during the quietest hours of the night, decisions that would later raise questions about trust, pressure, and the consequences of choices made when emotions run high. The message on that glowing phone screen seemed simple enough at first glance, but the meaning behind it would soon reach far beyond a single conversation between 2 people who once shared a complicated past. And as investigators would later discover while piecing together the timeline of that night, the moment Jason Miller read those words marked the beginning of a story that would leave one person missing and an entire town searching for answers. The town where this story unfolded sits quietly in the American Midwest, the kind of place where life tends to follow familiar rhythms that rarely attract national headlines. Streets are lined with modest homes, the local diner opens before sunrise each morning, and most residents recognize one another by name. On weekends, families gather at school football games or community events, and the pace of daily life moves slowly enough that people believe they understand the stories unfolding around them. For decades the town had built a reputation for calm and stability, a place where serious crime felt distant and unlikely. When people spoke about living there, they often described it as a safe place to raise children, the kind of community where neighbors looked out for each other and strangers were noticed quickly. That sense of comfort shaped the way residents saw the people around them, including a man named Jason Miller, who had spent most of his adult life working quietly and building a reputation as someone dependable. Jason was known throughout the area as a construction manager who handled large development projects with careful attention to detail. He worked long hours, but the results of that work were visible in the homes and commercial buildings that slowly expanded the town's landscape. To the people who knew him, Jason Miller was the last person anyone expected to become part of a mystery. At 47 years old he had spent nearly 2 decades building what appeared to be a steady and responsible life. He was married, raising 2 children, and maintaining a demanding job that required both discipline and patience. Friends described him as practical and reserved, someone who preferred quiet evenings with his family rather than the kind of nightlife that sometimes brings attention or trouble. His routine rarely changed. He woke early, left for work before the roads became crowded, and returned home late in the afternoon carrying the quiet exhaustion that comes from managing large projects and dozens of workers each day. To the outside world, Jason's life seemed structured around responsibility. The image he presented to the community was that of a man who valued stability above everything else. That was why the events of April 17 would later feel so difficult for many people in town to understand. Because at exactly 2:03 in the morning, Jason Miller received a message that would pull him into a situation far removed from the calm life everyone believed he was living. The message came from Emily Carter, the same woman whose name had appeared unexpectedly on Jason's phone screen just moments earlier. For months they had not spoken, and both of them had attempted to move forward after ending the complicated relationship that once connected them. Yet in the quiet darkness of that early morning, Emily reached out with a request that sounded urgent and impossible to ignore. The message asking to talk immediately suggested that something serious had happened, something she believed could not wait until daylight. According to phone records that investigators would later examine carefully, Jason responded within minutes. Their exchange lasted only a short time, but the conversation was enough to convince him to leave his home and meet Emily in person. For someone who had worked hard to close that chapter of his life, the decision to respond to her message was not an easy one. Yet the weight of those 6 words, "We need to talk right now," carried a sense of urgency that pushed Jason toward a choice he might otherwise have avoided. Within minutes he was awake, dressed, and preparing to leave his house while the rest of the neighborhood remained asleep. What happened next would soon raise questions that investigators, reporters, and residents of that quiet Midwestern town would spend months trying to answer. Because within hours of sending that message, Emily Carter would disappear completely, leaving behind a timeline filled with gaps that no one could easily explain. When detectives began reviewing the events of that night, they focused immediately on the moment Jason Miller read the message on his phone. Why had Emily chosen to contact him at exactly 2:03 in the morning after months of silence? What was so urgent that it required a meeting before sunrise? And what exactly happened after Jason left his house and drove into the darkness of the sleeping town to meet the woman who had suddenly reappeared in his life? These questions would soon form the center of an investigation that unfolded slowly, revealing pieces of a story that no one in the community had expected. Because as detectives continued gathering evidence and examining the timeline of that early morning conversation, they would eventually reach a conclusion that transformed the meaning of that message entirely. What first appeared to be a simple request for a conversation was only the beginning of a much deeper mystery, one that would reveal how a single decision made during the quietest hours of the night could alter several lives forever. And as investigators would later say while looking back at the moment that started everything, that text message at 2:03 a.m. was only the first piece of a far more troubling story waiting to unfold. To understand why the message that arrived at 2:03 in the morning carried such weight, investigators later had to look carefully at the lives of the two people connected by it. Jason Miller was 47 years old at the time, a construction manager who had spent most of his life in the same Midwestern town where the events of this story unfolded. People who knew him often described him as someone defined by quiet discipline rather than attention-seeking behavior. He woke early each morning, drove to job sites scattered around the county, and spent long days coordinating crews, inspecting work, and making sure projects stayed on schedule. The homes and commercial buildings rising across the town stood as visible reminders of the work he supervised year after year. To neighbors and co-workers, Jason appeared dependable in the way many hardworking professionals in small communities strive to be. He attended school events for his children, maintained the lawn outside his modest home, and rarely gave anyone a reason to question the stability of the life he had built. But the calm image people associated with Jason Miller had not always matched the reality of what was happening behind the closed doors of his personal life. About 5 years before the message arrived on his phone that night, Jason found himself facing a period of pressure that many people in demanding careers eventually experience. Several construction projects he managed were delayed by financial issues, forcing him to spend longer hours away from home trying to resolve problems with contractors and investors. Those extended workdays slowly began to affect the balance of his marriage. Conversations at home became shorter, and the sense of connection that once defined his relationship with his wife began to fade under the weight of exhaustion and stress. Jason rarely spoke openly about those struggles with friends or co-workers, preferring to carry the responsibility quietly rather than draw attention to it. Yet the strain was real, and over time it created emotional distance in parts of his life where he once felt steady and confident. It was during that period of stress that Jason first met a woman named Rachel Carter, someone whose arrival in town would eventually place both of their lives on a path neither of them expected. Rachel Carter was 38 years old when she moved to the area, arriving with the goal of starting over after a difficult divorce that had left her searching for a new direction. She quickly found work as a real estate agent and approached the job with an energy that people noticed immediately. Rachel was confident, articulate, and determined to establish herself in a competitive market where reputation meant everything. Within a short time she built connections with local developers and construction companies who relied on agents to sell newly built homes. Her willingness to work long hours and meet clients whenever they were available helped her gain attention among colleagues who admired her drive. For Rachel, the move to the town represented more than just a change of address. It was an opportunity to rebuild a life that had been shaken by the end of her marriage. The town offered a slower pace and a chance to begin again, far from the memories that followed her in the place she had lived before. What she did not expect was that one of the professional connections she made early in her career there would gradually turn into something far more complicated. Jason Miller and Rachel Carter first crossed paths during the development of a new housing community on the edge of town. Jason was responsible for supervising the construction of the homes, while Rachel worked with buyers interested in purchasing the properties once they were completed. At first their conversations were strictly professional. They discussed building timelines, property features, and the kinds of details that help potential homeowners make decisions about where to live. Over time, however, their interactions became more frequent as the project continued. Construction developments require constant communication between builders and agents, and Jason and Rachel often found themselves discussing work late in the afternoon after most other people had left the site. Those conversations gradually extended beyond the practical details of the job. They talked about career challenges, long workdays, and the personal struggles that sometimes accompany demanding professions. For Jason, the conversations offered a rare opportunity to speak openly about pressures he rarely shared with others. For Rachel, the connection provided companionship during a period when she was still adjusting to a new town and a life that looked very different from the one she had known before. As weeks turned into months, the connection between them deepened in ways that neither of them openly planned. Friends who later learned about their relationship would describe it as intense from the beginning, built on shared frustrations and emotional honesty that developed during a time when both of them were facing personal uncertainty. Yet the relationship carried a complication that made it impossible to exist openly. Jason Miller was still married, and despite the difficulties in his marriage he had not made any decision to leave his family. That reality forced the relationship with Rachel Carter into secrecy. They met privately when work schedules allowed, and their conversations remained hidden from the people who knew them both professionally and socially. For a while, the secrecy seemed manageable, but over time the emotional weight of that situation began to change the dynamic between them. Rachel, who had already experienced the collapse of one marriage, reportedly hoped the relationship might eventually become something more stable and visible. Jason, however, struggled with the consequences such a decision would bring to his family and the life he had spent years building. Gradually the connection that once felt supportive began to show signs of strain. Friends who later spoke with investigators described hearing about disagreements that became more frequent as time passed. Rachel Carter wanted clarity about the future, while Jason Miller felt trapped between responsibilities he did not want to abandon and emotions he found difficult to ignore. The tension created by those opposing expectations slowly transformed their conversations. What once felt like companionship during a difficult time began to feel like pressure neither of them knew how to resolve. Eventually the situation reached a point where continuing the relationship seemed impossible. According to Jason, the two agreed to end their contact and move forward separately. Months passed without communication, and both appeared to return to their routines as if the chapter connecting them had closed. That was the version of events Jason later described to investigators and to people who asked about Rachel Carter after she disappeared. Yet the message that appeared on his phone at 2:03 in the morning suggested that the story between them had not ended as completely as he believed. Because long after their last conversation, Rachel Carter reached out one final time, sending a message that would pull Jason Miller back into a situation neither of them would escape easily. April 17 began like any other night in the quiet town where Jason Miller lived, but the moment his phone lit up at 2:03 in the morning marked the beginning of a sequence investigators would later examine minute by minute. The message from Rachel Carter appeared exactly as he had seen it moments earlier, simple but urgent. "We need to talk. Right now." Jason stared at the words for several seconds before typing a reply asking what was wrong. According to phone records later obtained by investigators, Rachel responded immediately, insisting that the matter could not wait until daylight. Their exchange continued for only a few minutes, but the tone of the conversation suggested urgency on Rachel's part and hesitation on Jason's. Messages moved back and forth quickly until they agreed to meet somewhere public where they could talk privately without drawing attention. Rachel suggested a roadside diner located near the edge of town, a place known for staying open all night to serve late-shift workers and travelers passing through the area. Jason paused for a moment after reading her last message, aware that leaving his house in the middle of the night to meet someone he had not spoken to in months would be difficult to explain if anyone discovered it. Yet the insistence in Rachel's words made the situation feel impossible to ignore. Within minutes he dressed quietly and stepped outside while the neighborhood remained completely still. Security cameras mounted on a nearby home would later confirm that Jason Miller's car backed out of his driveway at approximately 2:18 in the morning. The headlights briefly illuminated the quiet street before the vehicle turned toward the main road leading out of the neighborhood. The drive to the diner took less than 10 minutes, passing through dark stretches of road where the only movement came from occasional trucks traveling between towns. When Jason arrived, the diner's parking lot was nearly empty except for a few vehicles belonging to overnight staff and customers who had stopped in for coffee. Rachel Carter was already there, standing near the edge of the lot beside her car. Witnesses inside the diner later told investigators they noticed the moment Jason pulled into the parking area because Rachel appeared to walk quickly toward his vehicle as it came to a stop. From the windows inside the building, several people could see the two of them speaking beside the driver's side door. Although no one could hear the conversation itself, observers later described the body language between them as tense and urgent, suggesting the meeting involved more than a simple exchange of words. The conversation in the parking lot lasted only a short time, perhaps a few minutes according to those who watched from inside the diner. At first Rachel stood beside Jason's open window, speaking with him while he remained seated behind the wheel. Then something unexpected happened that several witnesses would later remember clearly when questioned by investigators. Rachel opened the passenger door of Jason's car and stepped inside. For a moment the vehicle remained parked as the two continued talking. From the outside it appeared as though the discussion had moved from the open parking lot into the privacy of the car where their voices could not be heard. A few moments later the headlights brightened, and Jason's vehicle slowly backed away from the space before turning toward the road leading away from the diner. No one inside the building realized they had just witnessed the final confirmed moment when Rachel Carter would be seen alive. The car disappeared into the darkness of the highway, leaving the quiet parking lot behind as if the meeting had been nothing more than a brief late-night conversation between two people settling unfinished business. Investigators would later spend weeks reconstructing the events that followed after Jason Miller drove away from the diner with Rachel Carter sitting in the passenger seat. Traffic cameras positioned along the highway captured glimpses of Jason's car traveling toward the outskirts of town, but the recordings revealed little about what happened inside the vehicle during that drive. Phone records showed no further messages sent from Rachel's device after the moment she left the diner. The signal from her phone moved briefly along the same route as Jason's car before disappearing entirely sometime shortly before 3 in the morning. By the time daylight reached the quiet streets of the town several hours later, the meeting that began with a 6-word message had already unfolded into something far more serious. Friends and co-workers who expected Rachel Carter to appear at work that morning would soon begin calling her phone, unaware that the last time anyone had seen her was during that short conversation in the parking lot of the diner. And as investigators would later conclude while reviewing the timeline of that night, the moment Rachel stepped into Jason Miller's car marked the beginning of a mystery that would leave the entire community searching for answers. Because by the time the sun rose over the town that morning, Rachel Carter had vanished without a trace. The following morning began quietly, but it did not take long for people close to Rachel Carter to notice something unusual. Rachel was known among colleagues as someone who rarely missed work without notice. Her schedule as a real estate agent required constant communication with clients, and she normally responded quickly to calls and messages throughout the day. But on the morning after that late-night meeting, her phone remained silent. By midday several co-workers had attempted to contact her without success, and by the afternoon concern began to spread among the people who knew her well. At first some assumed she might simply be dealing with a personal matter that required time away from work. Yet as the hours passed with no response to calls or messages, the situation began to feel increasingly serious. By evening, one of Rachel's close friends contacted local authorities to report that something did not seem right. Officers responded by visiting Rachel Carter's apartment, hoping to determine whether she had returned home after leaving the diner in the early hours of the morning. What they found inside the apartment raised immediate concern. Her car remained parked outside the building. Personal belongings such as her purse and daily planner were still inside the apartment. Nothing suggested she had packed or prepared to leave town. The details indicated that Rachel Carter had never made it back home after the meeting that began with a message at 2:03 a.m. Once the missing person report was filed, investigators began the process of reconstructing Rachel Carter's last known movements. Detectives quickly focused on the message exchange between Rachel and Jason Miller that had taken place shortly before their meeting at the roadside diner. Phone records confirmed the exact time the message was sent and showed that Jason responded almost immediately. Within a short time, investigators contacted Jason to ask about the events of that night. Jason did not deny meeting Rachel Carter. In fact, he acknowledged the meeting openly and explained that she had asked him to talk about unresolved issues from their past relationship. According to Jason, the conversation between them became tense once they were inside the car after leaving the diner. He told detectives that Rachel appeared upset and began arguing about decisions he had made months earlier when they ended their relationship. Jason claimed the argument lasted only a short time before he eventually drove her toward the neighborhood where she lived. According to his explanation, he dropped Rachel off near her apartment building sometime before 3 in the morning and then returned home without seeing her again. At first glance the account sounded possible, but detectives soon discovered details that raised doubts about that version of events. One of the first clues investigators examined was the location data from Rachel Carter's phone. Digital records showed the device traveling away from the diner along the same road Jason Miller would have taken when leaving the parking lot that night. The signal moved steadily through several areas of town before abruptly stopping shortly after 3 in the morning. What troubled investigators was the location where the phone signal disappeared. It was not near Rachel's apartment building. Instead, the final transmission came from an area several miles away, close to a stretch of woodland located outside the town limits. Detectives compared this information with traffic camera recordings collected from intersections along the route Jason had taken earlier that night. One of those cameras captured Jason Miller's car driving toward the same wooded area where Rachel's phone signal ended. The timestamp on the footage aligned closely with the moment investigators believed Rachel's device stopped transmitting data. When confronted with this information, Jason maintained that he never stopped in that area and insisted he had driven directly back toward his neighborhood after dropping Rachel off. Yet the digital evidence suggested that something else may have happened during the drive after leaving the diner. As investigators continued examining phone records, traffic cameras, and GPS information from nearby cell towers, a new timeline began to form around the final hours before Rachel Carter disappeared. Detectives mapped the route Jason Miller's car appeared to take during the drive and identified several points along the road where surveillance cameras briefly captured passing vehicles. While none of the footage clearly showed what happened inside the car, the images reinforced the possibility that Jason's vehicle had traveled near the wooded area where Rachel's phone signal ended. Because of that discovery, search teams were soon sent to examine the forested land outside town. Officers walked through narrow trails and dense clusters of trees while volunteers joined the effort to cover as much ground as possible. For days the search continued, expanding across fields and wooded sections that stretched for miles beyond the road where Jason's car had been seen. Investigators hoped to find any sign that might explain what happened after Rachel left the diner with Jason Miller that night. Yet despite the growing effort and the increasing attention from local news outlets, the search produced no immediate answers. Weeks passed as investigators continued following every possible lead connected to Rachel Carter's disappearance. Detectives spoke again with Jason Miller, revisiting the details of his account in hopes that new information might reveal inconsistencies in the timeline. They interviewed co-workers, friends, and anyone who might have seen Rachel during the hours before she vanished. Volunteers distributed flyers with Rachel's photograph throughout nearby towns while local media outlets reported updates on the case. Yet the central question remained unanswered. No one had seen Rachel Carter after she stepped into Jason Miller's car in the diner parking lot during the early hours of that morning. The forest search produced no clear evidence linking the area to her disappearance, and without additional clues investigators found themselves facing the possibility that the truth about that night might remain hidden indefinitely. For the residents of the town, the mystery began to weigh heavily on the sense of safety they once associated with their quiet community. The idea that someone could disappear after a late-night meeting without leaving behind clear evidence left many people unsettled. And as the weeks slowly turned into months, investigators began to suspect that the full story of what happened after that 2:03 a.m. message had not yet been revealed. Because as detectives would later explain when looking back at the investigation, the truth about that night would only emerge after time had passed and new evidence began to surface. As the investigation continued, detectives began uncovering details that had not been visible during the early weeks of the search. At first the case appeared to revolve around a simple question: what happened after Rachel Carter stepped into Jason Miller's car in the diner parking lot that night? But as investigators examined Rachel's personal belongings and digital records more closely, they discovered something that shifted the entire direction of the case. Rachel had been carefully keeping records of her communication with Jason Miller. Among the files on her phone and computer were messages, saved conversations, and notes that suggested she had been documenting their past relationship for some time. Some of those messages revealed frustration about the way the relationship had ended months earlier. Others suggested she had considered revealing the truth about their involvement to people who were unaware it had ever existed. For detectives trying to understand the urgency of the message Rachel sent at 2:03 in the morning, those records suddenly provided an important piece of context. The request to meet that night may not have been a spontaneous decision after all. It appeared increasingly possible that Rachel Carter had contacted Jason because she intended to confront him about the past and perhaps expose details he had hoped would remain private. Investigators also uncovered financial information that added another layer to the situation. Bank records revealed a series of transactions between Jason Miller and Rachel Carter that had taken place quietly over several months. The amounts varied, but together they represented a significant sum of money that had moved between accounts without any clear business explanation. Detectives considered several possibilities while reviewing those transactions. Some believed the money might have been connected to financial help Jason provided during their relationship. Others suspected the payments could represent attempts to resolve personal disputes or prevent information from becoming public. Whatever the purpose of those transfers had been, the discovery strengthened the theory that the relationship between Jason and Rachel had become far more complicated than the version Jason initially described to investigators. What began as a hidden relationship may have evolved into a situation defined by secrecy, pressure, and growing resentment on both sides. If Rachel had planned to confront Jason about those issues during their meeting that night, the conversation inside his car may have been far more intense than anyone realized when they watched the two leave the diner parking lot together. With this new information in hand, detectives decided it was time to question Jason Miller again. Months had passed since Rachel Carter first disappeared, and investigators had spent that time assembling a clearer picture of the circumstances surrounding their meeting. When Jason returned to speak with detectives, they presented the evidence they had gathered, the records Rachel had kept, the messages suggesting she intended to reveal their relationship, and the financial transactions connecting the two over a long period of time. Faced with that growing body of evidence, Jason's explanation of the events that night began to shift. At first he repeated his earlier claim that he had simply dropped Rachel near her apartment after an argument in the car. But as detectives continued asking questions about the timeline and the evidence contradicting parts of his story, his account slowly began to change. According to prosecutors who later described the interview in court, Jason eventually admitted that the argument inside the car had become far more heated than he originally acknowledged. The confrontation escalated until it turned physical, and during the struggle Rachel Carter lost her life. The admission marked a turning point in the investigation that had puzzled the community for months. Jason told investigators that panic set in immediately after the confrontation. Realizing the seriousness of what had happened, he attempted to hide the truth rather than report the incident. According to his statement, he drove toward the wooded area outside town where traffic cameras had earlier captured his vehicle traveling that night. There, he left Rachel Carter's body in a remote section of forest, believing the area's isolation would prevent the discovery of what had taken place. For months investigators had searched that region without locating clear evidence connected to Rachel's disappearance. But after Jason's statement provided a more precise description of where he had gone, search teams returned to the same wooded area with new focus. The location Jason described was deep within the forest, far enough from the main road that earlier searches may have passed nearby without detecting anything unusual. Several days later, a team working through the dense terrain discovered human remains in a secluded part of the woodland. Forensic testing confirmed what many people had feared since the beginning of the investigation. The remains belonged to Rachel Carter. The discovery ended months of uncertainty about her fate but also brought a wave of grief and anger to the community that had followed the case so closely. What began with a 6-word message sent in the quiet hours of the night had ultimately revealed a confrontation fueled by unresolved emotions, secrecy, and the pressure created by a hidden relationship that had never truly ended. The truth about what happened inside Jason Miller's car during the early hours of April 17 had taken months to emerge, but once investigators pieced together the evidence and Jason's admission, the story of that night finally came into focus. Yet even with the answers now visible, the events that followed that message at 2:03 a.m. would continue to raise questions about how quickly a moment of conflict can alter the lives of everyone involved. In the months that followed the discovery in the wooded area outside town, the investigation moved from unanswered questions to a courtroom where the events of that early morning would be examined in detail. Prosecutors formally charged Jason Miller with crimes connected to the death of Rachel Carter, and the case quickly drew intense attention from the community that had followed every development since the day Rachel was reported missing. Residents who once viewed their town as a place untouched by serious tragedy now found themselves watching a story unfold that had begun with a single message sent in the middle of the night. During the trial, investigators presented the timeline they had spent months assembling. They described the message Rachel sent at 2:03 a.m., the meeting in the diner parking lot, the drive captured by traffic cameras, and the evidence uncovered in Rachel's personal records showing the complicated history between the two. The courtroom listened as prosecutors explained how that late-night confrontation escalated inside Jason's car and ultimately ended Rachel Carter's life before the sun rose that morning. Jason Miller's defense attorneys offered a different interpretation of what had happened during those final hours. They did not deny that Jason had been with Rachel Carter or that the argument between them had become physical. Instead, they argued that the confrontation had developed quickly and emotionally after Rachel insisted on discussing issues from their past relationship that Jason believed had already been resolved. According to the defense, the message Rachel sent that night triggered a conversation neither of them expected to become so intense. They described the situation as a tragic chain of events fueled by fear, stress, and the pressure that had surrounded their secret relationship for months. In their view, Jason Miller had not set out that night intending to harm Rachel Carter. They argued that the encounter in the car became chaotic during a heated argument that neither of them managed to control. Yet for many people watching the trial unfold, that explanation did little to soften the reality of what had taken place. Others saw the story through a very different lens. To them, the message Rachel Carter sent at 2:03 in the morning represented more than a request for a conversation. It was the moment when a hidden relationship that had been carried quietly for months finally reached its breaking point. The evidence presented during the investigation showed a pattern of secrecy, pressure, and unresolved tension that had been building long before the night Rachel asked Jason to meet her at the diner. When the jury considered those details alongside Jason Miller's own admission about the confrontation in the car, they ultimately reached a verdict that held him responsible for Rachel Carter's death. The conviction brought a legal conclusion to the case, but it did not erase the questions that lingered in the minds of many people who had followed the story from the beginning. For the quiet town where both Jason Miller and Rachel Carter had lived, the events of that night changed the way residents viewed the calm streets they once believed were untouched by tragedy. A single message. As the story comes to an end, it returns to the same quiet moment where everything began. A dark bedroom, a silent house, and a phone screen glowing softly in the early hours of the morning. At 2:03 a.m., a message appeared that seemed simple at first glance. 6 words that carried a weight no one could fully understand in that moment. We need to talk. Right now. For Jason Miller, those words would lead to a decision that changed the course of his life forever. For Rachel Carter, that message would become the final step in a chain of events that ended in tragedy. What began as a late-night conversation between two people with a complicated past would eventually grow into an investigation that captured the attention of an entire town and revealed how fragile the line between ordinary life and irreversible consequences can be. When investigators looked back at everything that happened that night, they all returned to the same starting point, a message sent in the quiet hours when most people are asleep and the world feels distant and calm. That message was the moment when years of hidden tension finally reached the surface. For some people who followed the case, the events that followed felt like the result of a confrontation that suddenly became uncontrollable. For others, the sequence of decisions made after that message suggested something more deliberate, a series of choices that turned a late-night meeting into a life-altering crime. The truth revealed in court answered many of the legal questions surrounding the case, but the deeper human questions remain difficult to resolve even today. So now the story turns to you. When you look back at the events of that night, starting with the message that appeared on Jason Miller's phone at 2:03 in the morning, what do you believe really happened inside that car after the two left the diner parking lot? Was it a tragic argument that grew beyond control in a moment of anger and fear, or was it something far more calculated from the beginning? Stories like this remind us how a single decision made in the quietest hours can change several lives forever. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective might reveal something others have not considered. And if you enjoy real mysteries and true stories like this, make sure you subscribe for more stories that explore how one moment, one message, or one decision can alter everything that comes after.